History of the World by J. M. Roberts. Book 4 The Age of Diverging Traditions. Chapter 2 The Arab Empires. In 661, the Arab governor of Syria, Muawiyah, set himself up as the caliph after a successful rebellion and murder, though not at his hands, of the Caliph Ali, cousin and son in law of the Prophet. This ended a period of anarchy and division. It was also the foundation of the Umayyad Caliphate. This usurpation gave political ascendancy among the Arab peoples to the aristocrats of the Quraysh, the very people who had opposed Muhammad at Makkah. Muawiyah set up his capital at Damascus and later named his son Crown Prince, an innovation which introduced the dynastic principle. This was also the beginning of a schism within Islam, for a dissident group, the Shiites, henceforth claimed that the right of interpreting the Quran was confined to Muhammad's descendants. The murdered caliph, they said, had been divinely designated as Imam to transmit his office to his descendants and was immune from sin and error. The Umayyad caliphs, correspondingly, had their own party of supporters, called Sunnites, who believed that doctrinal authority changed hands with the caliphate. Together with the creation of a regular army and a system of supporting it by taxation of the unbelievers, a decisive movement was thus made away from an Arab world solely of tribes. The site of the Umayyad capital, too, was important in changing the style of Islamic culture, as were the personal tastes of the first caliph. Syria was a Mediterranean state, but Damascus was roughly on the border between the cultivated land of the Fertile Crescent and the barren expanses of the desert. Its life was fed by two worlds. To the desert dwelling Arabs, the former must have been the more striking. Syria had a long Hellenistic past, and both the caliph's wife and his doctor were Christians, while the barbarians of the West looked to Rome. Arabs were to be shaped by the heritage of Greece. The first Umayyads speedily reconquered the East from dissidents who resisted the new regime, and the Shiite movement was driven underground. There followed a glorious century whose peak came under the 6th and 7th caliphs between 685 and 705. Unfortunately, we know little about the detailed and institutional history of Umayyad times. Archaeology sometimes throws light on the general trends and reveals something of the Arabs' impact on their neighbors. Foreign records and Arab chronicles log important events. Nevertheless, early Arab history produces virtually no archive material apart from an occasional document quoted by an Arab author. Nor did Islamic religion have a bureaucratic center of ecclesiastical government. Islam had nothing remotely approaching the records of the papacy in scope. For example, though the analogy between the popes and the caliphs might reasonably arouse similar expectations, instead of administrative records throwing light on continuities, there are only occasional collections preserved almost by chance, such as a mass of papyri from Egypt, special accumulations of documents by minority communities, such as the Jews, and coins and inscriptions. The huge body of Arabic literature in print or manuscript provides further details, but it is at present much more difficult to make general statements about the government of the caliphs with confidence than, say, similar statements about Byzantium. It seems nonetheless that the early arrangements of the caliphates, inherited from the Orthodox caliphs, were loose and simple, perhaps too loose, as the Umayyad defection showed. Their basis was conquest for tribute, not for assimilation, and the result was a series of compromises with existing structures. Administratively and politically, the early caliphs took over the ways of earlier rulers. Byzantine and Sassanid arrangements continued to operate, Greek was the language of the government in Damascus, Persian in Ctesiphon, the old Sassanid capital, until the early 8th century. Institutionally, the Arabs left the societies they took over by and large undisturbed except by taxation. Of course, this does not mean that they went on just as before. In the northwestern Persia, for example, Arab conquest seemed to have been followed by a decline in commerce and a drop in population, and it is hard not to associate this with the collapse of a complex drainage and irrigation system successfully maintained in Sassanid times. In other places, Arab conquest had less drastic effects. The conquered were not antagonized by having to accept Islam, but took their places in a hierarchy presided over by the Arab Muslims. Below them came the converted neo Muslims of the tributary people. Then the Himmi, or protected persons, as the Jewish and Christian monotheists called. Lowest down the scale came the unconverted pagans or adherents of no revealed religion. In the early days, the Arabs were segregated from the native populations and lived as a military caste in special towns, paid by the taxes raised locally, forbidden to enter commerce or own land. This could not be kept up, like the Bedouin customs brought from the desert. Segregation was eroded by garrison life. Gradually, Arabs became landowners and cultivators, and so their camps changed into new cosmopolitan cities such as Kufa or Basra, the great entrepot of the trade with India. More and more Arabs mixed with the local inhabitants in a two-way relationship as the indigenous elites underwent an administrative and linguistic Arabization. The caliphs appointed more and more of the officials of the provinces, and by the mid 8th century, Arabic was almost everywhere the language of the government. Together with the standard coinage bearing Arabic inscriptions, it is the major evidence of Umayyad success in laying the foundations of a new, eclectic civilization. Such changes were effected fastest in Iraq, where they were favored by prosperity as trade revived under the Arab peace. The assertion of their authority by the Umayyad caliphs was one source of their troubles. Local bigwigs, especially in the eastern half of the empire, resented interference with their practical independence, whereas many of the aristocracy of the former Byzantine territories immigrated to Constantinople. The elites of Persia could not. They had nowhere to go and had to remain irritated by their subordination to the Arabs, who left them much of their local authority. Nor did it help that the later Umayyad caliphs were men of poor quality who did not command the respect won by the great men of the dynasty. Civilization softened them. When they sought to relieve the tedium of life in the towns they governed, they moved out into the desert not to live again the life of the Bedouin, but to enjoy their new towns and palaces, some of them remote and luxurious, equipped with hot baths and great hunting enclosures, and supplied from irrigated plantations and gardens. There were opportunities here for the disaffected, among whom the Shia, the party of the Shiites, were specially notable. Besides their original political and religious appeal, they increasingly drew on social grievances among the non Arab converts to Islam, particularly in Iraq. From the start, the Umayyad regime had distinguished sharply between those Muslims who were and those who were not by birth members of an Arab tribe. The numbers of the later class grew rapidly. The Arabs had not sought to convert and sometimes even tried to deter from conversion in early times. But the attractiveness of the conquering creed was powerfully reinforced by the fact that adherence to it might bring tax relief. Around the Arab garrisons, Islam had spread rapidly among the non Arab population, which grew up to service their needs. It was also very successful among the local elites who maintained the day to day administration. Many of these neo Muslims, the Mawali, as they were called, eventually became soldiers too. Yet, they increasingly felt alienated and excluded from the aristocratic society of pure Arabs. The Puritanism and orthodoxy of the Shiites, equally alienated from the same society for political and religious reasons, made a great appeal to them. The increasing trouble in the east heralded the breakdown of the Umayyad authority. In 749, a new caliph, Abu al Abbas, was hailed publicly in the mosque at Kufa in Iraq. This was the beginning of the end of the Umayyads. The pretender, a descendant of an uncle of the Prophet, announced his intention for restoring the caliphate to orthodox ways. He appealed to the wide spectrum of opposition, including the Shiites. His full name was promising. It meant shedder of blood. In 750, he defeated and executed the last Umayyad caliph. A dinner party was held for the males of the defeated house. The guests were murdered before the first course, which was then served to their hosts. With this clearing of the decks began nearly 2 centuries during which the Abbasid Caliphate ruled the Arab world, the first of them the most glorious. The support of the Abbasids enjoyed in the Eastern Arab dominations was reflected by the shift of the capital to Iraq, to Baghdad, until then a Christian village on the Tigris. The change had many implications. Hellenistic influences were weakened. Byzantium's prestige seemed less unquestionable. A new weight was given to the Persian influence, which was both politically and culturally to be very important. There was a change in the ruling caste too, and one sufficiently important to lead some historians to call it a social revolution. They were, from this time, Arabs only in the sense of being Arabic speaking. They were no longer Arabian. Within the matrix provided by a single religion and a single language, the elites which governed the Abbasid Empire came from many peoples right across the Middle East. They were almost always Muslims, but they were often converts or children of convert families. The cosmopolitanism of Baghdad reflected the new cultural atmosphere. A huge city rivaling Constantinople with perhaps 500,000 inhabitants, it was a complete antithesis of the ways of life brought from the desert by the first Arab conquerors. The great empire had come again to the whole Middle East. It did not break with the past ideologically, though, for after dallying with other possibilities, the Abbasid caliphs confirmed the Sunnite orthodoxy of their predecessors. This was soon reflected in the disappointment and irritation of the Shiites who had helped to bring them to power. The Abbasids were a violent lot and did not take risks with their success. They quickly and ruthlessly quenched opposition and bridled former allies who might turn sour. Loyalty to the dynasty rather than the brotherhood of Islam was increasingly the basis of the empire, and this reflected the old Persian tradition. Much was made of religion as a buttress to the dynasty, though the Abbasids persecuted nonconformists. The machinery of the government became more elaborate. Here, one of the major developments was that of the office of vizier, monopolized by one family until the legendary caliph Harun al Rashid wiped them out. The whole structure became somewhat more bureaucratized, the land taxes raising a big revenue to maintain a magnificent monarchy. Nevertheless, provincial distinctions remained very real. Governorships tended to become hereditary, And because of this, central authority was eventually forced onto the defensive. The governors exercised a greater and greater power in appointments and the handling of taxation. It is not easy to say what was the caliphate's real power, for it regulated a loose collection of provinces whose actual dependence was related very much to the circumstances of the moment. But of Abbasid wealth and prosperity at its height, there can be no doubt. They rested not only on its great reserves of manpower and the large areas where agriculture was untroubled during the Arab peace, but also upon the favorable conditions it created for trade. A wider range of commodities circulated over a larger area than ever before. This revived commerce in the cities along the caravan routes which passed through the Arab lands from east to west. The riches of Harun al Rashid's Baghdad reflected the prosperity they brought. Islamic civilization in the Arab lands reached its peak under the Abbasids. Paradoxically, one reason was the movement of its center of gravity away from Arabia and the Levant. Islam provided a political organization which, by holding together a huge area, cradled a culture which was essentially synthetic mingling. Before it was done, Hellenistic, Christian, Jewish, Zoroastrian, and Hindu ideas. Arabic culture under the Abbasids had closer access to the Persian tradition and a new contact with India, which brought to it renewed vigor and new creative elements. One aspect of Abbasid civilization was a great age of translation into Arabic, the new lingua franca of the Middle East. Christian and Jewish scholars made available to Arab readers the works of Plato and Aristotle, Euclid and Galen, thus importing the categories of Greek thought into Arab culture. The tolerance of Islam for its tributaries made this possible in principle from the moment when Syria and Egypt were conquered. But it was under the early Abbasids that the most important translations were made. So much it is possible to chart fairly confidently. To say what this meant, of course, is more difficult, for though the texts of Plato might be available, it was the Plato of the late Hellenistic culture transmitted through interpretations by Christian monks and Sassanid academics. The culture these resources influenced was predominantly literary. Arabic Islam produced beautiful buildings, lovely carpets, exquisite ceramics, but its great medium was the word spoken and written. Even the great Arab scientific works are often huge prose compendia. The accumulated bulk of this literature is immense, and much of it simply remains unread by the Western scholars. Large numbers of its manuscripts have never been examined at all. The prospect is promising. The absence of archive material for early Islam is balanced by a huge corpus of literature of all varieties and forms except the drama. How deeply it penetrated Islamic society remains obscure, though it is clear that the educated people expected to be able to write verses and could enjoy critically the performances of singers and bards. Schools were widespread. The Islamic world was probably highly literate by comparison, for example, with medieval Europe. Higher learning, more closely religious in so far as it was institutionalized in the mosques or special schools of religious teachers, is more difficult to assess. How much, therefore, the potentially divisive and stimulating effect of ideas drawn from other cultures was felt below the level of the leading Islamic thinkers and scientists is hard to say. But potentially, many seeds of a questioning and self critical culture were there from the 8th century onwards. They seem not to have ripened. Judged by its greatest men, Arabic culture was at its height in the East in the 9th and 10th centuries, and in Spain in the 11th and 12th. Although Arab history and geography are both very impressive, its greatest triumphs were scientific and mathematical. We still employ the Arabic numerals, which made possible written calculations with far greater simplicity than did Roman numeration, and which were set out by an Arab arithmetician, although in origin they were Indian. This transmission function of Arabic culture was always important and characteristic, but must not obscure its originality. The name of the greatest of Islamic astronomers, Al-Khwarizmi, indicates Persian Zoroastrian origins. It expresses the way in which Arabic culture was a confluence of tributaries. His astronomical tables, nonetheless, were an Arabic achievement, an expression of the synthesis made possible by Arab Empire. The translation of books from Arabic to Latin was of huge importance to Christendom. By the end of the 12th century, most of Aristotle was available in Latin, many of the works having come by this route. The administration and repute of Arab writers among Christian scholars was a recognition of its importance. Of the works of Al-Kindi, one of the greatest Arab philosophers, more survive in Latin than in Arabic, while Dante paid Ibn Sina, Averroes, the compliment of placing them in limbo together with Saladin, the Arab hero of the crusading epoch, when he allocated great men to their fate after death in his poem, The Divine Comedy, and they were the only men of the Christian era whom he treated thus. The Persian practitioners who dominated Arabic medical studies wrote works which remained for centuries standard textbooks of the Western training. European languages are still marked by Arabic words which indicate the special importance of Arabic study in certain areas. Zero, cipher, almanac, algebra, and alchemy are among them. The survival of a technical vocabulary of commerce too, tariff, magazine, is a reminder of the superiority of Arab commercial technique. The Arab merchants taught Christians how to keep accounts. One English king minted his gold coins on the pattern of Muslim dinars. Strikingly, this cultural traffic was almost entirely one way. Only one Latin text, it appears, was ever translated into Arabic during the Middle Ages, at a time when Arabic scholars were passionately interested in the cultural legacies of Greece, Persia, and India. A single fragment of paper bearing a few German words with their Arabic equivalents is the only evidence from the 800 years of Islamic Spain of any interest in Western languages outside the peninsula. The Arabs regarded the civilization of the cold lands of the north as a meager, unsophisticated affair, and no doubt it was. But Byzantium impressed them. An Arabic tradition in visual art founded under the Umayyads also flourished under the Abbasids, but it was narrower in its scope than Islamic science. Islam came to forbid the making of the likeness of the human form or face. This was not scrupulously enforced, but it long inhibited the appearance of naturalistic painting of sculpture. Of course, it did not restrict architects. Their art developed very far within a style whose essentials had appeared at the end of the 7th century. It was at once in debt to the past and unique to Islam. The impression produced upon the Arabs by Christian building in Syria was the catalyst from it they learnt. But they sought to surpass it, for believers should, they were sure, have places of worship better and more beautiful than the Christian churches. Moreover, a distinctive architectural style could visibly serve as a separating force in the non Muslim world, which surrounded the first Arab conquerors of Egypt and Syria. The Arabs borrowed Roman technique and Hellenistic ideas of internal space, but what resulted was distinctive. The oldest architectural monument of Islam is the Dome of the Rock, built at Jerusalem in 691. Stylistically, it is a landmark in architectural history, the first Islamic building with a dome. It appears to have been built as a monument to victory over Jewish and Christian belief. But unlike the congregational mosques, which were to be the great buildings of the next 3 centuries, the Dome of the Rock was a shrine glorifying and sheltering one of the most sacred places of Jew and Muslim alike. Men believed that on the top of the hill it covered, Abraham had offered up his son Isaac in sacrifice, and that from it Muhammad was taken up into the heavens. Soon afterwards came the Umayyad Mosque at Damascus, the greatest of the classical mosques of a new tradition. As so often in this new Arab world, it embodied much of the past, a Christian basilica, which had itself replaced a temple of Jupiter, formerly stood on its site, and it was itself decorated by Byzantine mosaics. Its novelty was that it established a design derived from the pattern of worship initiated by the Prophet in his house at Medina. Its essential was the mihrab, or alcove, in the wall of the place of worship, which indicated the direction of Makkah. Architecture and sculpture, like literature, continued to flourish and to draw upon elements culled from traditions all over the Near East and Asia. Potters strove to achieve the style and finish of the Chinese porcelain, which came to them down the Silk Road. The performing arts were less cultivated and seemed to have drawn little on other traditions, whether Mediterranean or Indian. There were no Arab theatres, though the storyteller, the poet, the singer, and the dancer were esteemed. Arabic musical art is commemorated in European languages through the names of lute, guitar, and rebec. Its achievements, too, have been seen as among the greatest of Arabic culture, though they were to remain less accessible to the Western sensibility than those of the plastic and visual arts. Many of the greatest names of this civilization were writing and teaching when its political framework was already in decay, even visibly collapsing. In part, this was a matter of the gradual displacement of Arabs within the Caliphate's elites, but the Abbasids, in their turn, lost control of their empire, first of the peripheral provinces and then of Iraq itself. As an international force, they peaked early. In 782, an Arab army appeared for the first time before Constantinople. They were never to get so far again. Harun al-Rashid might be treated with respect by Charlemagne, but the first signs of an eventually irresistible tendency to fragmentation were already there in his day. In Spain, in 756, an Umayyad prince who had not accepted the fate of his house had proclaimed himself Amir, or governor of Cordoba. Others were to follow in Morocco and Tunisia. Meanwhile, Al-Andalus acquired its own caliph only in the 10th century. Until then, its rulers remained emirs, but long before that was independent de facto. This did not mean that Umayyad Spain was untroubled. Islam had never conquered the whole peninsula, and the Franks recovered the northeast by the 10th century. There were by then Christian kingdoms in the northern Iberia, and they were always willing to help stir the pot of dissidents within Arab Spain, where a fairly tolerant policy towards Christians did not end the danger of revolt. Yet, Al-Andalus, though not embracing all Iberia, prospered as the center of a Muslim world. The Umayyads developed their sea power and contemplated imperial expansion not towards the north at the expense of the Christians, but into Africa at the expense of Muslim powers, even negotiating for alliance by the Byzantium in the process. It was not until the 11th and 12th centuries, when the Caliphate of Cordoba was in decline, that Spain's Islamic civilization reached its greatest beauty and maturity in a golden age of creativity which rivaled that of Abbasid Baghdad. This left behind great monuments as well as producing great learning and philosophy. The 700 mosques of 10th century Cordoba numbered among them one which can still be thought the most beautiful building in the world, the Mesquita. Europe, a door to the learning and science of the East, but one through which were also to pass more material goods as well. Through it, Christendom received knowledge of agricultural and irrigational techniques, oranges and lemons, sugar. As for Spain itself, the Arab stamp went very deep, as many students of the later Christian Spain have pointed out, and can still be observed in language, manner, and art.